Thank you again for joining us today for our webinar, Trusted Access Governance and the European GDPR. This webinar will discuss how today's organizations around the globe are under constant pressure to ensure their digital infrastructure and assets are safe due to the ever-growing regulations and elevated business risks that face them. As a result, they spend a great deal of time and money utilizing numerous solutions and techniques to safeguard what is most important. Yet many overlook a widely used privileged access tool which is often unknown and unmanaged. Those are SSH user keys. SSH keys aren't just an IT issue, and many organizations are unknowingly at risk of not properly managing SSH keys, and when combined with new compliance regulations such as GDPR, the risks are often compounded. For the webinar today, we have two distinguished speakers to help review the timely topics of trusted access governance and the European GDPR. It is my pleasure to welcome our guest, Rob Westervelt from IDC. Rob is a research manager with IDC Security Products Group. He provides insight and thought leadership in the areas of cloud security, mobile security, and security related to the Internet of Things. Rob is also responsible for research and analysis around a wide range of evolving security markets, including endpoint security, security and vulnerability management, as well as identity and access management. I would also like to introduce our resident compliance expert, Fouad Khalil, who will help guide you through the inner workings of GDPR. Fouad is SSH Communications Security VP of Compliance, who has extensive experience in the technology space with more than 25 years spanning disciplines in software development, IT support, program and project management, and most recently, IT security and compliance management. With those introductions, I will now turn the conversation over to Rob. Rob, please take it away.
Hey, thanks very much, Ruben, and thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start off today's discussion by talking a little bit about exactly what SSH user keys are, why they must be effectively managed in the context of data security and the EU GDPR. And certainly, if you've seen the news lately, and the data breach statistics, you know that the number of data records lost and stolen has increased significantly. In fact, if you see on the screen there, over 7 billion records lost or stolen since 2013. I just checked that this morning, and it's eclipsed 9 billion records lost or stolen since 2013, and still only 4% of the breaches encryption was used in only 4% of those breaches. And that is actually from the breachlevelindex.com, something where that continues to go up and up every single day. So SSH Key Management is very important and often just forgotten about within the organization. I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of enterprises that are undergoing an assessment and getting a handle on their SSH keys, and it's something that is that they're taking very seriously, driven by compliance issues. So, what exactly is or are SSH keys? Secure Socket Shell is a network protocol that basically provides administrators with a way to access remote Unix or Linux servers and applications. And it's also implemented for remote management of networking equipment and other devices. And SSH mainly ensures two things. It establishes trust, right, and secure communication, in that it provides strong authentication using public key cryptography. And SSH also ensures encrypted data communications at the transport layer on an insecure network such as the Internet. So in addition to enabling IT administrator access, SSH can be used for automated application-to-application processes. So it can be a little bit more complex than simply an IT admin reaching out remotely to do some kind of management activity. And SSH is used very widely among businesses, both large and small. They can even have, 1, 2, or 3-man IT team. it's for that remote command line login and execution. Primarily to deliver software updates, do some troubleshooting. I've seen it used for database updates, and even cloud provisioning of late, since cloud is being so widely adopted. An SSH server by default actually listens on the standard TCP port 22, and there's a tool to enable FTP-like transfer, file transfer using SSH. So SSH is truly at the foundation of that secure copy and secure file transfer protocols. And you know, the current set or version of the secure shell protocols is SSH2. -2, and at the connection layer, SSH allows for the tunneling of login sessions, right? And TCP forwarding, as I mentioned, using the actual SSH server. And this really allows administrators to set up a VPN for encrypted communications. Most organizations actually use AES, but SSH supports, of course, a wide variety of cryptographic protocols that are used today. And there are some significant threats. So we've established that SSH is a critical or important protocol for businesses in the context of the EU GDPR. Let's talk about a little bit about SSH and data security risks. Interestingly, the threats to SSH don't typically take advantage of the protocol itself. A lot of the attacks out there, an attacker is going after the low-hanging fruit, and that is exactly what we're seeing with SSH. You know, what's the easiest way to attack SSH? Well, stealing SSH keys. They can be used as a backdoor to bypass privileged access management solution. And in fact, we just saw news recently break about the exposure of thousands of documents on a U.S. military project. How did this breach actually happen? Well, the attacker gained access to the SSH keys of a government contractor, and the IT engineer who was this IT engineer himself was in charge of managing some critical government systems within Amazon's cloud storage instance. And a lot of these files, 60,000 files that were exposed, were discovered on this Amazon server, and this included passwords to U.S. government systems, and significant problem if you aren't managing your SSH keys. Manufacturers also make mistakes as well, and hard-coded passwords is a significant issue, and that also goes for HTTPS server certificates, and we're seeing this hard-coded password problem also happen in Internet of Things devices. So this implementation weakness provides an avenue for an attacker, this backdoor access to eavesdrop on communications, for example. You can literally steal data in near real time in some instances if they have the right tools to do it. The problem was found in some, in fact, I should say that in the past year or so, some widely used network security appliances. This was just last year. These appliances, security appliances, from two popular security vendors had issues where the SSH keys or the hard-coded passwords were hard-coded to these appliances. Now, the issues have been resolved and patched, but as you probably know, many organizations are slow to test and deploy patches. So it's certainly worth noting. And we know that there could be as many as 4 million hard-coded passwords out there today, maybe even more now since I last put that slide together. It's a significant issue. While an attacker can steal SSH passwords, they can also brute force their way in using freely available password cracking tools. So malware can certainly take advantage of unmanaged SSH keys, and that puts regulated data at significant risk of exposure. Unfortunately, one of the most dangerous issues is our implementation errors and the improper issuance of a key to a root account. And if an attacker gains a key that's actually authorized for root access, well, I tell you, it's pretty much game over. If you gain root access, you get complete control and access to sensitive information. Even access to a user account. Actually, that user account doesn't have to have root access, but the attacker still gets the ability to modify any data for that particular user account. And forensics investigators time and time again tell me that attackers have gotten extremely good at elevating user privileges. There's a lot of automation there, a lot of innovation around ways to elevate user privileges. It's a continuing battle against malware. So we've been speaking about SSH in context with data security, and IDC's security analyst team in Europe, our team in Europe, they conducted a survey of this was more than 170 CIOs, and it was on the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And here's some of the study's key findings. Among the chief concerns or challenges with the GDPR is the right to be forgotten and a right to erasure. In fact, 43% of them, as you see there, CIOs, said understanding how to properly meet the spirit of the right to be forgotten rule and right to erasure was a challenge. And this is because, frankly, there aren't a lot of automated processes that exist to adequately carry out a citizen request to erase their information. And we know under the GDPR this has to be done in a timely manner. We'll talk a little bit about this later on in the presentation. Another significant challenge was determining the meaning of the phrase in the GDPR that speaks to data protection by design and by default. What does that truly mean? Well, in the context of today's conversation, data protection by design means literally that cryptographic settings, key management, and management of automated processes around key management, they should be addressed during the earliest phase of a project, the design phase. This is extremely important not only for security, but we found on the security products team here at IDC that there can be a pretty significant cost savings to addressing encryption, authentication, and other data security functions early on during the design of a product or service rather than actually putting it on afterwards. So there is certainly some cost-benefit analysis there that could be done to really get folks from a little more active in addressing security issues as early as possible in the process. An assessment is definitely necessary to identify if SSH keys are needed or if they've already been used for interactive and automated access to systems. And this goes beyond simply a technology challenge, right? Policies need to be communicated, and processes, both automated and manual processes, these must use recognized standards for key management. And this is something that if it hasn't been addressed, it certainly needs to be addressed at this point with the GDPR coming down the pipe in 2018. So data protection by default. What is data protection by default? What does it mean? In the context of SSH keys, it means proactive management is necessary, and putting in place the approvals or the coordination. Taking advantage of the earliest phase of a project and making sure that security is in place by default. The user doesn't have to take any kind of extra access or extra steps to ensure their security or privacy is extremely important and is in the general spirit of the GDPR. And I wanted to get back to the survey itself. You know, what exactly are the priorities of CIOs to meet the GDPR? And do you know where your data is? I tell you, if you can't accurately answer the question, where is your data, especially where's your regulated data, then it's going to come down to a data discovery and a classification exercise, and identifying applications that use GDPR relevant data was the top priority in the recent survey that we did. 48% of CIOs told us that. And they told us that data discovery and indeed data classification was a significant priority. They're already, if they haven't, they're already undergoing data discovery and classification exercises. You know, accurately classifying data and keeping control of visibility over it is of profound importance if you're going to be enforcing the security policies that you've hopefully effectively communicated. It's just got to be done. You have to know which security solutions that or which policies that are in place and the security solutions that enforce them. Have to understand what data needs to be protected and needs to be protected in a relevant way. I tell you, before we move on, I wanted to speak to this whole idea of trusted access. And so in conclusion, at least in my part of the presentation today, before turning it over, let me just sum up my main message and the importance of SSH key management. The one thing that we are seeing, we know that trusted access is certainly increasing in importance as enterprises embrace cloud infrastructure and services. 70% of CIOs have a cloud-first strategy now, so cloud adoption is increasing. With IoT now, the Internet of Things, you have IoT projects that collect data, and we just did a survey on this, and we know some IoT projects are 5 and even older than 5 years old or more. So that space is beginning to mature very rapidly. IoT projects that collect data on EU citizens to support a product or a service, you know, by 43%, or by 2019 rather, 43% of IoT data is expected to be processed at the edge of the cloud. So that regulated data isn't necessarily flowing directly into the cloud, and the edge, typically an edge gateway, is where some security needs to be applied. So another issue that impacts data security. And speaking of cloud, we will see many more security products delivered from the cloud and for the cloud. And, you know, everything from cloud-powered encryption, threat analytics, and on. It continues to build up. We continue to see a variety of functional security products that are now being ported to cloud delivery, SaaS delivery. So what exactly does the EU GDPR mean? It means data protection throughout the entire life cycle, data discovery and classification, encryption, of course, and obfuscation. That includes SSH key management along with identity and access management. Pseudo-anonymization, something you may hear about in the second portion of our presentation today. Continuous testing and monitoring. And, you know, one of the areas that is getting significant attention with regards to the GDPR is the idea of segmenting your network and continuously monitoring that segmentation to ensure that you can maintain a segmented network that contains the regulated data. And backup and recovery, of course, you need system redundancy and backups especially important today with the rise of ransomware and the idea of do you have solid backups in order to recover from an attack like that? And then finally, the last portion of the data lifecycle, and that's data destruction. A lot of organizations may have a policy there, but and you'll actually find that you'll reduce your scope of compliance if you go through and identify data that you just simply do not need. So SSH keys are certainly, these threats to SSH keys are real. Forensics investigators have identified SSH keys as a root cause of some of today's largest data breaches. News just recently broke about a trove of data on a U.S. secret military project. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So it is happening in front of our eyes, and organizations, they must conduct an assessment to identify whether your SSH keys are in fact being proactively managed. I've talked to a number of organizations that have undergone this kind of assessment and have found thousands of SSH keys that just have not been actively managed and ultimately decommissioned. So those keys are available and active, and attackers certainly can get at it. And as I mentioned earlier, the GDPR isn't prescriptive. So it's not like the payment card industry data security standards in the United States, where PCI DSS speaks to very specific areas of security technology. The GDPR is more of a focus on the full data lifecycle. And for a deeper dive into the GDPR, I want to turn it back over to Ruben and Fouad of SSH. Ruben?
Thank you, Rob. I now will make Fouad the presenter so he can then start sharing his screen. And take it away, Fouad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Rob, for an excellent presentation. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to listen in about the SSH keys, as well as what GDPR means to your organization. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to go through the GDPR regulation and highlight a little bit what organizations need to expect and how to best prepare for GDPR. Please note that I will be covering this from a high-level perspective. If we needed to take a deeper dive, I think we will need a lot more time than 1 hour. I'd like to give you a high-level understanding of it, learn about why it was introduced, the importance of it, what does it really mean, impacts of ignoring privileged access to your production environments, and then hopefully give you the ammunition to walk away and make some decisions and take some action within your organizations. So let's take a quick look on the history of GDPR. In 1984, the Data Protection Act, or DPA, was a UK act of Parliament that defined the law on how to protect data. In 95, the Data Protection Directive was also enacted, and it was adopted in 95, basically regulating the processing of personal data within the EU. And then in 98, the Data Protection Act of 98 was passed. Of course, we've had other regulations brewing. We had the International Safe Harbor Privacy Principles and other stuff like that that was enacted to protect information exchange between residents of the EU as well as the US. And then in 2016, GDPR was approved by the European Parliament and will take effect on May 25th of 2018. So the countdown is on, okay? I've been actually looking at this clock for quite some time, and for a while back, I remember we had roughly about 2 years to go, 6 months to go. I was just looking at it this morning before I wanted to update my slide, and I realized we have less than a year to go. So it's not far away. A year is not a long time. And if you have not taken action within organizations to start looking and considering those requirements and trying to make progress towards them, now is the time. So why enact it? The Data Protection Directive has been around for 20 years. I mean, in the U.S., similar fashion has been a lot of laws that were brewing for years, and they continue to be updated different number of years after another. And then the Data Protection Directive set minimum standards for data protection. It was difficult for European citizens to know how their data is protected, as well as difficult for organizations to determine which laws to comply with. So at that point, the European Commission decided to issue a unified law, GDPR, General Data Protection Reg, which will supersede all laws passed by member states. All right, if I may just take a deeper dive into GDPR, but try to stay at a high level. I'm going to show you the next few terms that you need to know. This is a little bit of a busy slide, I apologize, but I figured it's enough to have these terms put in front of you because they're used across the board when you're talking GDPR. There are 5 common terms, starting with the data controller, which is the organization, your place of work. And they're the organizations that process personal data. Data subjects are the you and I's, that our data is being processed by a data controller or a processor who are service providers of the data controller, and they will process on behalf of the controller. Now they have the supervisory authority, which are basically the enforcers. They will be the ones that will come in and enforce the requirements on the various organizations. And of course, they will be the ones that will investigate breaches that may take place. And I'll dive a little bit more deeper on the enforcement aspect of it. And last but not least, personal data. In my opinion, what GDPR did is took what I'm used to seeing in the US as far as definition of personal data, protected information, and so on. They expanded it to include online identifiers, such as your IP addresses and your cookie information, and so on and so on. So it's very detail-oriented, and it's hard to identify what's in scope and what's not. By default, I recommend that everything that you think is important should be in scope of GDPR. So what about this GDPR? People say that the only way to avoid complying with it is to avoid doing business with the EU completely. Well, we know that's not going to happen. This is what the regulation says. I'm not going to read it. It simply means organizations should put in place a privacy compliance framework to ensure data processing is in compliance with GDPR. It's really as simple as that. A lot of organizations have already taken steps and already have compliance and privacy frameworks implemented. You may just have to customize it and expand it to satisfy various requirements. If not, there's a lot of industry-recognized frameworks you can look at, such as the ISO IEC 27001 or the British Standard 1012. So that information is out there, is readily available, and there's all kinds of downloadable material you can get to get you started. Now you ask, what's the scope of GDPR? Well, obviously it's to protect all personal data. They have broken up into 3 scopes. There's the material, which again talks about collecting, use, or other processing of data. As my colleague Rob mentioned earlier, you need to look at the entire life cycle of data, from creation through destruction. That's how you ensure that you have total control and you can talk to the requirements as far as protecting that data. Territorial, GDPR applies to any organization in the world if it services European data subjects. And governance. All organizations have an obligation to comply and show or demonstrate compliance with the requirements, manage the risks. You have to show evidence of how you are managing the risks, such as cyber risk, as well as be ready, God forbid, that we have a breach and you need to notify and figure out what those requirements are. All right, so let me highlight some of the key requirements, which I think will be worthwhile to mention. I'm going to go quickly through this busy slide. The 6 privacy principles, they're carried over from the Data Protection Directive days, and I will be highlighting those 6 in the next slide. We have Article 15, which basically provides the rights of access. It requires companies to detail what personal data is being processed and how upon request, which might be difficult to do if you don't have total grasp and control and understanding of the life cycle of data within your organization. I love this one, which is the right to be forgotten and to data erasure. So it means companies are to stop processing and delete personal data upon request. Data portability, they have the right, the UNI, to enable transfer of personal data between companies upon request. We have Articles 30 and 34, which talks about reporting data breach. I'm going to dive into that a little more later. They require data protection impact assessment, and that is also coming in the later slide, and that's a new process basically to ensure that organizations address the risk across the whole process of handling and processing personal data. I will be highlighting the data protection officer requirements. And of course, Article 50 extends the data protection requirements internationally. As I mentioned earlier, any organization globally is responsible to comply as long as they process European citizen data. And of course, last but not least, there are the fines. And I will highlight that one big fine that GDPR talks about in a later slide. So back to those 6 privacy principles. So GDPR puts forth 6. As I mentioned earlier, their original days are data protection directive days. Lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Basically saying that you and I must be told what processing will occur, and that whatever description they have for that process actually matches what happens within your organization. The purpose limitation, that only the data can be used for the purpose explicitly identified when I give permission or consent to you to use my data. Data minimization. So the information is, you collect only what's adequate and relevant to what's necessary. Accuracy, which I think will be very good if we had accurate data across the EU and the world, because it will give us better business results, of course, and better business data to act on. But basically, GDPR is indicating that the data must be accurate and when necessary, kept up to date. Storage limitations, personal data is kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than necessary. Goes back to the erasure requirements. I can call and say, I want my data deleted. You are no longer authorized to keep my data within your systems. And of course, the integrity and confidentiality, which are really the 2 of the 3 pillars of security. And that's quite important, especially when you look at it from a financial perspective. Okay, data protection officer. Just to fall back real quick, there are some requirements as far as who, what needs, or what requirements to meet to have a data protection officer assigned. You are more than welcome to look at that, but I recommend from a practitioner perspective that whether your requirements meet the law to have a DPO role or not, you should have someone in that capacity. You should have somebody that can talk to the data. You should have somebody that will be able to talk to the stakeholders as well as address the authorities when the need arises. So based on that, the DPO should have some background, maybe a law degree or some certification in security or data protection and privacy and so on. Put the individual in a position to handle the compliance with the requirements. And then the officer, DPO, is a protected and independent role as stated by GDPR. So they are not, their neck is not on the line if a breach happens. They will be independent, they're protected, and they will stand out as the individual that talks to the entire process, the processing, the data usage, and so on, and provides the necessary data or act as a liaison with the supervisory authority. So their primary tasks, to sum it up into 4, they are responsible to make sure everyone in the organization knows their GDPR obligations. They monitor compliance, one of my favorites. They provide advice regarding the data protection impact assessment and make sure that the performance is as expected. And cooperates with supervisory authority as the main contact point. Now, I've made a mention a couple of times about the data protection impact assessment. What is that? I mean, in BCP days, they call it business impact assessment. This is more of a data protection. It's a key tool for the data protection officer, and it's mandated by GDPR. So organizations must have that in place. Just to give you a feel of what a data protection impact assessment contains, just to name a few, you would have a description and the processing and purposes of handling that data, an assessment of the necessity of the processing. Why do you actually need to process data in that fashion? And then, of course, the assessment of the risks. And the GDPR makes a mention of rights and freedoms of data subjects. So I'll make a mention later, but their focus is there should be no high risk or impact to rights and freedoms of data subjects. Then you may consider yourself off the hook from reporting a breach or taking any further action. Make sure that all safeguards and security measures are in place to demonstrate compliance. It's also an indication of data protection by design, which Rob did a great job mentioning that. It talks about list of recipients of personal data, as well as details whether data subjects have been consulted. So you can see this goes really to an extensive level to make sure that you satisfy an auditor or supervisor or authority representative knocking on your door for additional information. The data protection impact assessment is a tool to manage risk, but it's only a subset or part of the whole process. Now, Rob did and I did as well highlight the fact that you need to know where your data is, okay? There's no explicit requirement for data mapping in GDPR, but it would be extremely difficult, in my opinion, to meet the requirements without establishing what and where and how, or basically the life cycle of personal data within your organization. So data mapping is an excellent exercise where you can come in and simply identify what the information is. Does it exist? Where it is? And the conditions under which it's kept. And some of the things that you will need to be able to build a data map range from the data items itself, the format, so the state of which the data items are stored, encrypted or not, in use, in transmission, and the like. You can take the state of any data and guaranteed it will be in scope of GDPR. How is it being transmitted? And what locations is my data housed? So as you see the flow from the principles going into the data protection impact assessment, now going into the data protection officer role, and then looking at the data mapping aspect, it's all about the data. And there's a lot of say from GDPR on how the citizens of the European Union have a say into their data rights. And there's an extensive section in this 200-plus page regulation, but they focus a lot on rights and the individual rights. Now, allow me to highlight some of them. Of course, I'm not going to go through all of them. Some things that are worth sharing. As I mentioned earlier, the core rule remains the same with the 6 principles. Consent. I mentioned that there are stricter requirements in obtaining consent to justify processing of personal data. They highlight additional protection for children. Child consent only valid if he or she are under 16 years of age. The new data access rights, such as the right to be forgotten and the right to data portability. So I would like my data to be deleted, and I would like to restrict my data to one of the member states of the EU, nothing more. So you can imagine on the internal aspect of data processing, there will be a lot of controls, a lot of aspects you need to cover to ensure compliance with such rights of individuals. And then profiling. This is huge. This is somewhat new. You need to let them know the data subject of any profiling, such as online tracking, behavior advertising, and so on and so on. And a lot more robust privacy notices that you need to advise your customers or your users. Okay, of course, incident response and reporting. This is their definition right out of the book or the regulation. So it's basically saying breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, and so on and so on and so on. It's so broad. In my opinion, if you have any doubt about something being important, consider it in scope of GDPR would be my advice. Okay. So data controllers are required to notify the supervisor authority within 72 hours, that is 3 days after becoming aware of the breach. That is a very, very short time frame. Now, it can be avoided if the breach is unlikely to result in a high risk. Now, again, risk to the rights and freedom of natural persons or European citizens, whatever you want to call it. The only way you can provide solid data of that if you had a true data protection impact assessment, as well as a solid data mapping that shows where all the data is in all states. Then you can easily show the supervisory authority that the risk is low to minimal and there's no need to report a breach. And as with any breach, they should include the nature of it, whose neck is on the line, likely consequences of a breach, and what have you done about it to make sure it doesn't happen again. And of course, supervisory authority will be notified when there is a risk, and that would be an unfortunate situation. And you have to go beyond the supervisory authority if data subjects must be notified when the results are high risk to their rights and freedom. As you notice, the two key words that stood out so far since I started is data as well as risk. Know where your data is, assess the risk of that data, follow any framework from a privacy perspective, and you should be in a better shape or a good shape to respond to a breach or knock on your door. Now, nothing comes without an enforcement, of course. The GDPR enforcement, the SA within your country is the primary source of information and responsible for investigating a breach. The good thing, in a way, I guess, is the regulation refers to the one-stop shop mechanism. So organizations do not have to submit multiple investigations for the same case. And organizations in multiple jurisdictions only have to be investigated once, rather by each jurisdiction. So the supervisory authority power falls into three categories, and probably nothing new, is just business as usual. They have the right to investigate, they have to take action and make sure things are corrected, and they have the authority and advisory. They can continuously share updates and changes to the regulation, the codes of practice, and the like. And then if found in breach of the regulation, you could face admin fines up to 4% of your annual global turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. Now that is huge, those are large numbers, but of course this would be in the worst case scenario with a high risk, a confirmation of willful neglect, and there's a true data breach in a high risk fashion, then things might be a little bit tough. So what do we know so far? GDPR applies to all businesses that collect or process European citizens' data, regardless of where you are on the globe. 73% of data privacy professionals believe that the reg is most important change in the past 20 years. I tend to agree with that. 92% of businesses list GDPR as a top data protection priority. And you heard Rob earlier talking about C-level taking data inventory and making sure that you understand the total life cycle as a high priority. 68% of U.S. business plans to spend 1 to 10 million on GDPR just to prepare for their regulation. It is estimated that 28,000 data protection officer positions need to be filled by May of next year. So my advice to please prepare, get ahead of the game. We made a mention of more than one instance that compliance by design or protection by design. I've been a proponent of compliance out of the box. The more we integrate the controls that we need to protect what's important with our day-to-day procedures, the more that we find ourselves compliant by just doing our normal jobs. And the same applies when you try to comply with GDPR. Now, if you do not start early enough and you try to leave things to the last minute, you may face costly repercussions. And GDPR has many obligations, of course, but a lot of them can be resolved quickly and easily, especially if you have already adopted some privacy framework, security management process, and the like. If you're a large organization, you could face significant budgetary impacts, IT personnel, governance, but that's a given with any regulatory impact as such. Senior management buy-in is critical. I've learned over the years, if one advice I can give, if you do not have senior management buy-in, even when complying with regulatory requirements, you may face some showstopper that prevent you from getting where you need to be in the time you need it. Please know what and where and how data is processed. Data mapping is critical. I call it data mapping, the regulation calls it data mapping. You can call it data model, data inventory, whatever it is. Know where it is from creation to destruction is very critical. Again, awareness is key. Educate the masses. Training and awareness is very important. And please be ready to report a breach. there are very stringent notification requirements, as I highlighted just a couple of slides ago. Now, just to look back on what Rob started this webinar earlier on, is the SSH keys. Now, what I mentioned before, looking at the GDPR compliance, it's really overall a best practice to protect what's important. As professionals ourselves in the security and the privacy and whatever industry you're in and role you're in, your job is to make sure that we promote what we do and protect what's important. In a normal business day-to-day, it's hard enough to keep track of what access people have and what is authorized versus not. And when you focus on SSH keys, I call that the dark side. And the reason being, it has been a ticking bomb propagating over time. It's been around since the mid-90s, ever since it was invented by Tauti Alonen from the University of Helsinki in Finland. You carry the term access. Who has access to data? Okay. SSH keys are a critical component of logical access. It's a critical component of your privileged access, and of course, critical component of your third-party access. You would hear about a lot of breaches in the health industry, and a lot of those are resulting from uncontrolled third-party access into their protected health information data. When you talk access such as this, it has major impact across all critical frameworks. I get all kinds of questions, people saying, what framework really SSH keys comes into play? My typical response is, are you concerned about access to your production information? Yes. Well, SSH keys is a part of it then. There's no exclusion. One thing you know why I call it also the dark side is ownership and responsibility is not clearly defined. And last but not least, since the SSH protocol itself is an encrypted, a high-level encryption, if you're not auditing and logging that channel, or you're not clear on where it came from and what trusted connection you had, how would you even investigate if a breach of that occurred within an SSH connectivity? So really, it's a dark side, and I would hope you would give it the right attention that it needs. So with that, I would like to leave you with one final thought. As you give consideration to access within your organization, I'm sure everybody has talked about passwords and other types of credentials within your organization. And what type of access do we grant to our production environment? And the domain access, the local user access, and so on and so on. We do such an excellent job when it comes to that. Allow me to introduce you to a new formula that I hope you would walk away with, which is the access formula is only complete when you include SSH keys as part of your access formula. Then you can look and argue and say, yes, I have a total control, a complete picture of my access, looking across the board at all levels and all layers into my production environment. And with that, I will pass it back to Ruben.
Well, thank you, Fouad, for that, and Rob as well, for the information as well as your time in helping the audience here gain some insight on the topic of trusted access governance for GDPR. So actually, what I do see here, there are a couple questions that came through, and I'd like to take a few moments to pose those to each of you. And I think I'll start with the most current one that came through for you, Fouad, since it was about GDPR and it's top of mind. Now, this one came through, and it says something about here, it says DPOs. My organization does not, what if our organization does not meet the criteria for a DPO? Do we still have to assign one?
Excellent question. My response would be, I highly recommend that you assign somebody within that role and capacity. Someone at a high level with authority that will own the personal data protection. That individual will make sure that your organization is well-versed in these requirements. That individual will ensure that you survive an audit if it happens during or aftermath of a breach. So yes, whether the requirements say or you're excluded from formally assigning a DPO, I beg you to have someone in that role and capacity.
Okay, and one other one for you, Fouad, is the topic here, and this will then will lead in, I think, segue nice to Rob, because he has a couple questions too here for him. So since this is about SSH keys and we're trying to tie in GDPR, the question here is, what direct impact will unmanaged SSH keys have on GDPR?
Another excellent question. Thank you. GDPR, it places tedious accountability and obligations on data controllers, okay? You have to show compliance. It requires them to maintain documentation, as I mentioned earlier, data protection impact assessment and data protection by design and so on. Without complete inventory and management of all access, including SSH keys-based access, I find it almost impossible to satisfy the access requirements within GDPR. You need to be able to tell who, what, when has access to my data, and GDPR must include SSH keys when you conduct that assessment.
Okay, great. I think that addresses those questions about GDPR. And now circling back to early in the presentation for you, Rob, a couple questions came through and they seem to be tied to projects that might be associated with SSH keys, since you were talking about the risks, and I think that started to prompt some minds as to what that would really entail. So one question I have for you, Rob, says, how long does an SSH management project typically take within a company?
Yeah, sure. So it varies, but most of the organizations that I spoke to, or the security architects that I spoke to that were undergoing in the middle of a project, said it could take years for them because the organization was so large and the organization just hadn't had any idea if keys were ever rotated. The company hadn't kept track of any keys that were granted. So it can take that long, and the guidance that they gave me, some of the lessons learned were start with smaller wins. Business units, or not business units, but units that different parts of the organization where you can gain a quick win and then move on from there. Or add it on to a project that involves centralizing key management processes, something like that. So it runs the gamut, but it, an extensive project certainly could take years. Fouad, would you agree with that a project can take years?
Yes, I do agree with that, Rob. That is why a lot of times I find myself recommending to individuals who might feel overwhelmed trying to take on that huge monster. My recommendation would be is prioritize. Look at your highest risk environments, scope those out, focus your effort onto that, and then expand from there. It may take longer, but at least you're addressing the highest critical areas first, and then the effort starts from there.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And then the last question for you, Rob, and again, this I think is tied to, you struck a chord or a nerve about projects, and I'd have to look at the specific title the individuals are asking, but this question came through about, well, how do you do these SSH, or how do you undertake this kind of a project about SSH keys without disrupting the current, I guess, business or connections?
Yeah, and part of that answer is, there will be, I think, some pain there, because not only do you have to determine, what keys are out there, but you need to determine which ones are currently being used, and in some cases, you're going to have certain individuals that do not want to be give up control, so to speak, of a key rotation. They're just used to having their key. They don't want to be involved. So there's no real answer, I think, to that question. In a lot of cases, at least in anecdotally in the conversations I've had, a lot of these projects had come about because of negative audit findings, and that when that kind of issue comes up, certainly that turns some heads and gets people on board with the project. In other cases, it was simply a project of hardening system access from insider threats, and ultimately that project took a lot longer, and there was, I think there was a little less buy-in across the board from different business units. Fouad, in terms of conducting an assessment without disruption? Is it even possible, or maybe it is with automated tools or something like that?
Yeah, it should be possible. With automation and
Okay.
picking the right time, I think is doable, yes.
Even without disrupting like a business partner or contractor that may have SSH key access, or
Well, there's so many
strategies
unique,
in order to get around that?
there's so many unique scenarios. Not one answer will satisfy your question, but I would say there are ways where you can minimize at least impact to the processes that they follow when they're trying to do the assessments.
Yeah, and the resounding answer that I got, or consistent answer that I got, just from talking to people that have undergone or led some of these projects, is that they have to be done systematically, in such a way that just very carefully, so that that there's a minimal amount of disruption as possible. So.
Right.
Agreed. And well, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Fouad, again. This takes us to the top of the hour. And to everyone, I would like to thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar, and we hope you've been able to gain insights into how you can properly manage your trusted access governance and, of course, prepare for the up-and-coming GDPR legislation, which we are very concerned with that it's going to impact all companies around the globe because we are a global economy, and if you do business, like Fouad said, with any citizen in the EU, you're going to be impacted. So if you would like to learn more, please visit SSH.com or follow us on Twitter by following the handle @SSH. Thank you again, everyone, and this will conclude this webinar for today. Thank you.